Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Let me just give you a couple of things that are of interest maybe to you. One of the things we do programming-wise at Behold is we do a lot of programming. We work to bring the Amish young people in who are joining church. So we've, in the past 15 years, we've started reaching out to them and say, when you join church, we'll have an open evening. You bring your parents. Your parents should come. We send it to the ministers, and the ministers should come. So it's been really fascinating to observe how they've embraced that. And one of the things that they often say is, you can say things to them that we can't, which is true. We're the outsider. But we're in the middle of, we do it twice a year, 4 nights in late winter, 4 nights in late summer, corresponding to the baptismal times. So 3 Monday nights ago, we had 100 young people, their parents and ministers there. 2 weeks ago, we had 257 there. And this last Monday night, we had 444 in one night in the Mural Hall. And I said, you all have to breathe in unison in order not to run out of breath. But it was really intriguing to see, and it gives you hope when you're at those events. Also, I have one of my colleagues here, Elaine Miller. And Elaine is one of our tour guides. We have a really superb group of tour guides at Behold. Haven't been there, please come out. We can arrange something as a church sometime if you'd rather do that. But please come out and visit us. So we ended kind of the last week talking about the baptism, the first baptism. And it's easy for us to look back into history, and we love to sanitize history. Make it clean. This is not a clean movement. And we want to embrace all parts of it because it's what makes us today. So it's easy for us to look back and try to put it all together. This is a messy movement, and it's revolutionary. One of the things I want you to understand, that in their world, this is revolutionary. And it is revolutionary in 3 big pieces. And I've talked about this. I'll keep harping this because this is a piece we don't often understand. It is a revolution in religion. These are the first people, these Anabaptists, Vitelteifel, rebaptizers. They would actually say, no, we're not. This is our first baptism. We were only made wet when we were babies. But, so they're beginning to argue and say, and you think about it like this. Think about where is the center of religious authority? In the Roman Catholic world of that time, again, this is not being negative about any of the groups. The Roman Catholic world at that time, they would have said it is the hierarchy. So that's where religious power, and then the scriptures. So the Catholics gave us tremendous gifts through the Middle Ages. For instance, preserving the scriptures. I don't think we would have the scriptures intact as they are without having them in one language for 1,200 years. Through the time period where there's a lot of upheaval. So, but they would have argued that religious authority comes to the individual through that system. The Protestant reformers come along, and they have this sola scriptura. You've heard this? Scripture alone. Sola scriptura. And I'm a firm believer in Scripture. But because of that high emphasis on that, it needs a trained theologian to interpret Scripture. And so Luther and Zwingli both decried the fact that common people were reading the Scriptures and making decisions on it. And so think about this. So then you need the trained preacher, and so it comes through that screen. The Anabaptists come along, and they say religious authority lies, first of all, in your decision to follow Jesus. Nachfolge, this German term, Nachfolge, to follow after. German is backwards, so nach means follow. Nachfolge. No, it means after follow. To follow after. And so the Anabaptists, again, the movement isn't clean. There's messiness to this. They would have said, you cannot interpret any religious truth unless you have including Scripture, unless you have the living Word within you. So the living Word is required to interpret the written Word, and the center of religious authority lies in the individual gathering of believers as they study the New Testament together. So Berlin, the religious authority for Berlin to operate in today's world would come as Berlin, the brothers and sisters of Berlin gather together and study the scriptures. So it has this individual flavor where it springs up because of that. So Dutch Anabaptism looks different than Swiss Anabaptism. So again, it's this kind of idea that it is a living word, and so they would have said solo Christus, solo Christ, Christ alone is the first interpretive factor, or the first space where you go through it. So the living word, and then the scriptures, they had a high view of scripture. But this, you stop and think. I mean, you need the trained theologian, the hierarchy, and these people come along and say, no. It's a gathering of the brothers and sisters. And it sets religious authority on its head. And it is really intriguing how that then plays out. In the East, it plays out differently, because there they very firmly advocate this whole communal good thing, and they develop into the Hutterites. So it has this individual flavor, depending on where in Europe, in the German-speaking portions of Europe, is the primary areas. But it is also a political revolution. So Europe is divided up. See, one of my next slides, I'll just shoot to the slide so you can see it. Oops. So I pass it. Oh, it might be hidden. I'll have to.
No, you had it.
Did I have a map?
There.
Yeah. So this is a general map of Europe, and this area here, it's all the Holy Roman Empire. This is the French border. So France is over here. This area here is made up of about 440 principalities, individual principalities, ruled by a feudal, a ducal or an earl. So it's not Germany. Germany isn't in existence until 1848. It's all these little nations, county nations essentially. It'd be like if Holmes County is one country, Wayne County is another country, and then it's up to the individual. The people in the peasants living there, their religion is based on whatever the lord of the region is. So some of them are Protestant, some are Catholic. In fact, in Switzerland, the Swiss cantons are banded together. So Switzerland is an alliance of cantons, but 7 of them, I think, remain Catholic, and 6 go Protestant, and then they go to war with each other. It's called the Wars of Kappel. Actually, Ulrich Zwingli, who was Conrad Grebel and Felix Manz and George Blaurock's teacher, Ulrich Zwingli is killed at the Second Battle of Kappel in 1531. The famous statue in Zurich has him standing there with a Bible here and a sword planted into the ground. And so, but the Anabaptists come along and they begin to argue that the kingdom of Jesus should extend across all political boundaries. So it should cross all boundaries. In that world, that idea is treasonous. It is treason. And actually, they are condemned to death. For instance, Michael Sattler in 1527 is condemned to death, not for heresy, but because they were convinced he was treasonous, because he said, this is what Michael Sattler said. He said, they asked him, they had overheard a comment he made. The comment was, if he were to fight, he would rather fight on the side of the Turks than on the side of the Christians. Now, understand something. The greatest danger that all of Christian Europe feels is the Turks. They're Muslim. They're pushing north. They're pushing from. Go back to my map. They're pushing from the southeast, and they get to the gates of Vienna. So they're Muslims. By the way, Muslim cities in this time, did I tell you this about Muslim cities? Yeah. Muslim cities are the centers of culture. So it's not radicalized nearly as much as Islam is today in its fighting form. So, but the Anabaptists, back to Michael Sattler, so Michael, they bring him to court and they ask him, is it true that you said that if you were to fight on the side of the Turks, if you were to fight, you would fight on the side of Turks. And he said, it is so. He said, because they are Turks of the flesh, but you are Turks of the heart. And they immediately treason. And they executed him for that. And so don't for a minute think this is not a political movement. It is. But it takes shape differently than any politics that Europe has ever seen. And what these people are beginning to argue is that all boundaries, the kingdom of Jesus should cross all boundaries. Which is refreshing in today's world. It's also a social revolution. I'm a peasant. I make enough to live and eat, and the Lord of the manor keeps me perpetually poor. And I can't speak to him unless I'm given permission. There's certain clothing I can wear. I've told you this, didn't I? Certain clothing I can wear. For instance, if I'm a peasant man, I'm not allowed to wear pointy-toed shoes. I have to wear blunt-toed shoes. Only nobility can wear pointy-toed shoes because you can't move as well in pointy-toed shoes. Peasant women, you know the apron thing? I saw these Amish women at the event Monday night with aprons around their side and wide ties. That's typical attire of that time period, late 1700s, and they just brought it with them. The Anabaptists come along, and we know, for instance, in that first baptism, that there is a noblewoman in that room, Margaret Hattiger, was a noblewoman, and peasants. And, for instance, Mons is the son of a Catholic priest, former Catholic priest. It's now a Protestant, but he was born when his father was still a Catholic priest, which makes him an illegitimate son. And there's peasants, and suddenly they kneel together, and they break all the social order of Europe. And again, it's a movement that is 200 years ahead of its time in calling for the separation of church and state and this kind of breakdown of social order. And the authorities see them as the most dangerous people in all of Europe. So the movement is not clean. But even within the movement, Hubmaier, they wrestle with, should we defend ourselves? Should we defend ourselves? I mean, so it's easy for us to theoretically sit in a nice warm church building after eating good food and talk about, should we defend ourselves? Well, many of us haven't faced those kinds of issues. It's much harder when it's happening to your families. And you're out there. And so the movement, some of them use the sword for a while, then put the sword away. Some of them defend themselves. And by the way, the movement also spreads. I read an account, again, where Conrad Grebel moved north into St. Gall, Felix Mons moved north into St. Gall, and in one day baptized, it's either, they can't quite tell in the records, but he baptized either 300 or 500 people in one day. And it's like, you know, we think of this as this kind of quiet movement stuck in. It's not. The first 5 years, it flashes through Europe. Ulrich Zwingli says, dealing with the Catholics is child's play as compared to dealing with these dreaded Anabaptists. And I want you to get a flavor for the radicalness of it. The radicalness of it is religious, but it's also social and political. As they see that the and at core is this idea of what does it mean, what is the essence of Christianity? What is its essence? What does it mean to be a Christian? And both the Catholic and the Protestant portions of Europe said it means when you are born, you're baptized, you become a citizen and a member of the state, and then they have a confirmation or some other thing when you get to be an adult. But the Anabaptists say, well, how can an 8-year-old baby know? And again, once again, they're separating citizenship and church membership, which hasn't happened for at least 600 years in Europe. And so the authority's natural question is, how do we control our people? And they see the Anabaptists as robbing them of the ability to control the people, especially the peasants. So at its core, they develop ideas, and again, these men and women didn't, and by the way, it is men and women. George Hunson Williams says this is as nearly gender equalizing a place, Anabaptism is, as any other place in Europe. Because in the Roman Catholic system, women actually had agency. They could be nuns. But it was limited to that space. And in the Protestant world, they come around and close all the convents, and there is almost no agency. There is no space for women to operate in those circles. Among the Anabaptists, because of their view of an adult making that voluntary decision, women have a much more equal voice. And from the beginning, women have equal vote in most places. So when they make decisions as a church, women have equal voice. It is an American fundamentalism, and the isms of America have robbed Mennonite women of their agency. I want to be careful how I say it. My wife, I'm trying to convince her to come one night and do a thing one night. My Amish grandmother had more agency to operate than my mom did in the Mennonite church. Because when she went to church, she sat separately from Grandpa. And when they voted as a church, she went through alone. And I know a few times she didn't vote the same way as Grandpa. And her voice counted equal to Grandpa. By the way, when my grandma said, I want you to bring the horses in and plow the garden, he pulled off whatever he was doing, came and plowed the garden. It's been in the last, and again, I'm getting off track, but I want you to understand something in a bit about Anabaptist women, that has been the historic perspective of the Anabaptist church, is that women have an equal space. Now, as the movement coalesces and theologically begins to define itself, women lose some agency. But initially, women in Europe during this time period, for instance, were not permitted to testify in court because they were chattel. But Anabaptist women had to testify in court because the authorities said, you made a decision with your own mouth, so with your own mouth you will condemn yourself. So a third of the martyrs in the Martyr's Mirror are women. And once again, it's this kind of breaking down a social order in Europe that gives it space, and it appeals to the people. Remember, the Peasants' War is going on or just ended right now. And the peasants are looking for freedom from the oppression, and they see Anabaptism as offering them that. Men and women. And again, the core idea is that there is this kind of decision to follow Jesus. And so at its essence, Christianity is about following Jesus. It's not about saying the sinner's prayer or doing something like that. It's about making a decision to follow Jesus. That's about your relationship with God. The second thing that they begin to get a great deal of emphasis is that the community, the church, the individual gathering, they would have never perceived when they talk about church, they're not talking about the Church of Christ. They're talking about local groups who meet together. And they said, the local church, the Christian community that you're a part of, so when disciples of Christ gather there, you give and receive to each other. And from its beginning, they have this thing they call the rule of Christ, which is about Matthew 18, about how you confront issues within your church. So there's this kind of, it also is mutual aid, because as they're being persecuted, they need each other. By the way, the average life expectancy of an Anabaptist leader in the first 50 years of Anabaptism, from the time of their from the time they were chosen as leader till the time they died, is 2.5 years. So they went after the leaders and killed them prolifically. And then it began to coalesce by 1527, especially with the Schleidheim Confession of Faith. They begin to say, you're Christian, the essence of Christianity is discipleship, and your discipleship is expressed to the world around us through love and peace. And I was thinking about this. They don't have, this is a time period when they're being persecuted. They write the Schleitheim Confession of Faith as 7 articles, but they don't sit down. They don't have theologians sitting in dusty places writing theology, the theology of what we believe. It worked its way out of lived experience. One of the things I often think about, this is about your relationship with God. This is about your relationship with your brothers and sisters, and this is about your relationship with the world around us. And it has kind of a fully orbed feel to it. This is sometimes called the Anabaptist vision. I know there's been people critical of it in the last number of years, but when I read the sources from early Anabaptism, this is really clearly expressed. So, again, this is the areas where it begins to really grow. And so here is Zurich, 1525, those first baptism. But the Peasants' War is affecting this area, particularly this area. This is a much fought over area. In fact, in the 1600s, in the 30 Years' War, land would change hand 80 times in 30 years between the two opposing armies. So this is a land that's been fought over. It's a fertile Rhine Valley. Rhine River flows north, goes to Rotterdam, and so on. So it spreads. It spreads initially up into here, and then Strasbourg has a printing press and is a kind of cosmopolitan city, and it really spreads there. And then within a few years, it begins to spread north and finds its way to Holland and Amsterdam and those areas. We'll keep track of that in a minute. This is a little Swiss village called Schleitheim. I mentioned the Schleitheim Confession of Faith. 1527, between 40 and 60 people meet, men and women meet here, and they write what they try to do is write who they are. It has 7 articles. I'm not going to hold you to remembering these, but it's worth thinking about what they focused on. They focused on baptism, and it begins in English. This is a brotherly union. And they focus on baptism. They're clear about that. The next one is the most controversial of them. It's a ban. But let's step back from it a little bit and think about what a world where it's life or death. If you're baptized and you're caught, by now it's a capital crime. So you're going to get killed. What do you do when people recant or give up their fellow church members? The ban is not so much about when you leave the Amish church as we know it. The ban here is about what do you do with people who are a part of your movement and leave and know all your secrets, where you meet, what you're talking about there, and all these things. And they said we can't have any association with them because it'll give us up. It's about protection. Bread is communion. I have to use these alliterations, 3 B's and 4 S's. I don't remember them. Bread is about communion, and particularly in the early parts of the movement, they would have practiced communion much more regularly, much more, probably nearly weekly in some places. But they felt like communion took them back to the blood and body of Christ, the sacrifice of Christ. They're not Catholic in their idea of transubstantiation or Lutheran. They're much more viewed it as a remembering of. But they said you need regular remembrances of Christ. Separation. This is an interesting one because when we think about separation today, we think about being separate from the world, clothing and those kinds. It's not that. This is about not going to Protestant church or Catholic church services. And the reason for that is they had some people who they called the Halbglaub, or in German, Treuherzig, true-hearted or half-believers, half-baptizers. These are people who are sympathetic to the Anabaptist cause, but refuse to go all the way and would keep going to their Reformed or Protestant church and Catholic services, and then want to attend Anabaptist services as well. And they said you have to separate yourself. You have to make a decision. You can't be half-hearted. By the way, in particularly the Protestant world, if you didn't show up for church services after a few Sundays, the the preacher would come see you, and they had the right to levy fines on people who didn't show up for church. I think it's a wise idea, especially for people who go to Sarasota in the middle of the winter. I think it's good. But so there were people who were really sympathetic to the cause and cared deeply about it, but weren't willing to go all the way. So separation was them saying, you have to make a choice whether you're one of us or not. The sword, they're very clear that the use of the sword is outside the kingdom of Christ. It's simply stated. Shepherds is about pastors. They would actually have said that you should make sure his needs are all met, or their needs are all met. There are women preachers during this time period. There are women evangelists. My wife found records of a city council who said there's a group of women agitating and preaching in the streets. I like that. But they also then recommend that because of the short lifespan of preachers, they say when you lose your ministry, you should choose one very quickly in the same hour, they say, which means the next service. And it should come from a reputable person from within the group, which is where we get our historic way of doing it. And then the swearing of oaths. Now this is the one, when I was a little kid growing up, the preacher would read the standards in the church we went to, and he'd talk about swearing of oaths, and I said, that means I can't curse. What am I going to do when I pound my finger? It's not that. This is about oaths of allegiance. So everyone in Europe, if you're in an area, if you live in a Protestant area, the Duke of your area can come to you, come all citizens and say, we're going to have a ceremony where you have to swear your allegiance to us, to me. And the Anabaptists said, we can't do that, because you're ultimately not our king. We can swear, we have allegiance to Jesus only. It actually translates itself into the New World when the Mennonites and Amish come to America. When the Continental Congress, the first Continental Congress in the 1760s, wants to test the allegiance of its citizens, they ask for test acts. And they ask people to swear allegiance to the Continental Congress. And many of the Mennonites said, we can't. We have already affirmed our allegiance to King George. How can you have two kings? And so many of them are seen as Tories. Some of them moved to Canada because of that. Now, lest you think the movement is this kind of wonderful thing, it expresses itself a little differently in places. And in the North particularly, it takes this apocalyptic flavor. It's hard to not get the idea that the end is imminent when your whole world is falling apart. You know, have you ever been in those experiences where you say, boy, I wish Jesus would come back. I wish the world would end right now, the mess I'm in. Just let the mess be over, like the bills that he paid. And in the North especially, and what happens is, this man named, help me out, a man who died in prison, who voluntarily gave himself up, Hans Huet. He is a very influential Anabaptist preacher. By the way, these people are young. Let me just tell you this. Krebelmans, Blaurock, Huet, and all these people, they're in their 20s and early 30s. They're young. And anyway, his has a really apocalyptic taste to it. He says Jesus will return when he's in prison, so he voluntarily gives himself up. I also kept very careful track of the people he baptized, and I just tried to affirm this again this afternoon in some research. It is thought that he baptized about 10,000 people in 2.5 years of time. One time they were walking along the Rhine River and it had ice in it, and the person said, well, he'd like to be baptized, so he examined him on the spot and decided that he could baptize this person. They chopped a hole in the river and they immersed him into the Rhine River. I think I would have gone with pouring that day, but anyway. But he preaches his way north, and Europe is, again, there's lots of political tensions happening in Europe during this time. There's almost constant war. And so and the people are poor, the peasants are revolting, the leaders are angry, and so the world seems like it's coming to an end, the world as we know it. and the Northern Anabaptists kind of capitalize on that. And they begin to gather together, and one of the focal points becomes the North German city of Munster, where in the early 1530s they engaged this really good Lutheran preacher named Bernard Rothman. And Rothman actually begins to read scriptures and is rebaptized and leads the city kind of into Anabaptism. And he has the support of the city council, and by 1533, the majority of the city council is Anabaptist. By 1534, Rothman and a really able-bodied leader named Jan van Leyden are leading the city in this religious, and it is one of these. I'm careful how I say this, but it is a dynamic, moving space. And if you're interested in religion, you go to this city of Munster, and it begins to pull other Anabaptists in, particularly from Holland and the Netherlands. They come over there. It's a safe place to be. The city council gives them safety. And by early 1534, the city council is Anabaptist, decidedly. And they declare themselves the Anabaptist Kingdom of Munster. Now, the problem becomes, what do you do with those who aren't Anabaptist? So they drive them out of the city at the point of a sword in a sleet storm. The others, the unbaptized, unrepentant, non-Anabaptists. Well, now you have a pure city, right? The problem is, it's full of humans. And it is one of the few times that the Catholics and the Protestants join forces, and it's a cathedral town, so there's a cathedral in the town, and so the Catholics and Protestant areas around them join forces and lay siege to the city of Munster. And Leyden is a dynamic leader. It grows. This is an actual shot of St. Lambert's Cathedral when Bruce's and Vaughn's and us and their family was in Europe. I took this picture. That's St. Lambert's Cathedral, and it becomes the city. City Hall is here. It becomes the kind of the focal point. By the way, in cities in this time period, this is the cathedral. This is the cathedral, and this is the city hall. The cathedral tower has to be higher than the city hall tower because religion trumps, literally trumps politics. It was law. But anyway, and you can see the shape of the old city here. See the walls? Like that. That's the shape of the city. And the bishop's forces lay siege. They have food sources, and it very quickly breaks down. So it is a mid-sized city. There's about 15,000 people in the city. And the guilds, I should say something about the guilds. Guilds are like trade unions. There's a leathermakers guild. They're not trade unions as we know them today, but they're a consortium, and they're beginning to rise in power. And as they're beginning to rise in power in Europe, they lock into this struggle with the feudal system. And also, the other thing we should think about here is prior to the early 1500s and the development of the printing press, the largest cities are small. I mean, London, Paris, Cologne, Amsterdam, those are large cities. But other cities that we know as large, they aren't. And Munster is a mid-sized city. And the guilds are locked in a struggle with the bishop. And the bishop is the second son of a duke. And his bishopric was bought. This is one of the corruptions of the Catholic system that you can name, that they have named, is this nobility. Nobility had one or two sons, and if they had more than one son, the title could only pass to one son. And so what do you do with those others who you want them, but they're a little inconvenient? You only have one family farm to give away. And if you try to split it, it becomes problematic. Many of them bought bishoprics. So you could buy a bishopric, and your son became a bishop. Now, he could kind of keep living, and there were absentee bishops, essentially. And they had a great deal of power, but it's also a little bit, Problem. Follow the money, okay? Problematic problem. It's a problem that plagues Catholicism in this time period because there's money involved. And the guilds are locked in a struggle with this bishop, and so this new order comes in place. Now, very quickly, the situation within Munster deteriorates because this new order, Jan of Leiden and Bernard of Rotman, begin to say, we need to shut down all voices that are against us. So any books that we deem as bad, we're going to burn. They have public book burnings. Whenever you have book burnings and censorship like that, we should all step back from it a little bit and say, what's going on here? There have been moments in human history, including our history, where these have happened, and they always end up bad because it's an attempt to control the people. And so they do. Now, there's also a great deal of beginning signs of sexual deviancy. For instance, they begin to talk about polygamy, but only for the leaders. And the leaders would see a beautiful woman, and if she was married, they'd have her husband killed. I'd be dead, okay?
Straight from Scripture.
Yeah, it is. And it breaks down. Now, these are Anabaptists. And you should not try to not claim them. They're us. There is also a great deal of atrocities against minorities. Women and anyone who wasn't. You understand that term? Anyone who wasn't Anabaptist is out. And so it really, the order breaks down. And by 1535, it's really bad. Early 1535. So Jan of Leiden says he and his 12 disciples, by the way, he calls himself, he calls Munster the New Jerusalem and calls himself King David. This is all kinds of problems here. And he has 12 disciples. Yeah, think about that a little bit. Who else did? How did he see himself? And he says that the Lord spoke to him and he could single-handedly conquer the bishop's forces, 9,000 strong army on the outside, and he and his 12 disciples would ride out and single-handedly conquer them. So on Easter morning of 1535, he did, and promptly got his head cut off. He and his 12 disciples. And he had a protege named Jan Matthias, who immediately stepped into leadership, married his widow that day, and took over. And a few months later, somebody betrayed the city, and the authorities were able to break in. They killed all the men, and they put the three principal leaders, the Rotman and Jan Matthias and another man, on trial, and condemned them to death, killed them, and then put their bodies into these cages and hung the cages on the cathedral spire in Munster as a warning. These dreaded Anabaptists. They allowed the women and children who were there, if they were willing to recant, to leave, but they left penniless. Now, those cages are still hanging there. In 2017, when we were there, we saw them. I once asked the caretaker at the Munster Cathedral, in my broken High German, this is northern Germany, so it's a little harder to communicate, can you tell me what those cages are hanging up on the wall? And he said, are you Amish or in perfect English, are you Amish or Mennonite? Yeah. I was afraid he was going to hang me up there anyway. He said, that's the only people who ask. Now, why is this important for us to think about Munster? So, it keeps replaying itself in history. And I think we particularly are bent towards this a little bit. We'll get to that. Interestingly enough, I was in a class at Yale, Seminal Moments in Western Christianity. And I noticed the lecturer, Rona Johnson Gordon, was going to lecture on the Radical Reformation. I thought, this is my morning, 7:45 in the morning, prime time to have class. I love mornings. And I got there early, sat in the front. Contrary to what you think, I didn't sit in the front when I was a college student in my 40s. I sat in the back because I felt like an oddball. And so I sat in the back. By the way, when Narita, as a side note, when Narita and I moved to New Haven, you should all try this at least once. We moved there, and I woke up the next morning, and I thought, I know no one. I know no one within 100 miles of here. And when you move from Holmes County or a place like that, where you know a lot of people, and you move into a place like that, it's a little frightening. So I was in this class, and she gets up, and she's talking about Anabaptism. And she begins to, she's a wonderful lecturer, she's Scottish, she has a wonderful program. She begins to lecture, and she takes about a minute or two, talks about Zurich, and the first baptisms, and she launches into Munster. And she spends the next hour and 15 minutes lecturing about Munster. And I keep sliding lower in my seat. I don't want to be an Anabaptist here. And at the very end, she says, I know this may seem like an anomaly, looks at me, and there are other Anabaptists who didn't do this. But you have to understand the power of what Munster did to both the Radical Reformation and to Europe. And she had office hours right afterwards, and so I knocked on her door and she said, is that you, Marcus? Yeah. She said, I expected you would come. So she said, sit down. She said, I'm presuming you're not as impressed with my lecture as I am. I said, can we talk about the fairness of that lecture? And she was a wonderful Christian woman who we've come to admire a great deal. And she said, I think you should write your paper for this class on Munster. I don't want to write all about it. And she said, I think you should. She said, I don't think you realize. I said, when did you first hear a lecture about Munster? I said, well, this is my first one. She said, in Anabaptist, when you took Anabaptist history class in other places, did they talk about Munster? Yeah, in passing. She said, you need to talk about it. Your people need to talk about it. Because this is where it breaks down. And you know what I thought about? I did write my paper. I found some really fascinating things I'll tell you in a minute here. But she said, do you have any modern pieces to this part of the movement that you might be able to think about? She was leading me somewhere. And I said, Sam Mullet and Burkholz and the beard cutting. Back up. Look at this. Complete control. Sexual deviancy. Atrocities against minorities. It's all there. And the seed of Munster is in our movement. We don't like to hear that. So what I did was I thought, where else does Munster show up in history? And it shows up in America in the 1600s. In the 1670s, so the Puritans and Pilgrims were not Anabaptists. They're English Baptists, English Puritans, separatists, who moved to the New World, and they want New England to be a city set on a hill with a fence around it, where true Christianity can really thrive, and there's not impacts of other groups into New England, especially the Quakers. They hated the Quakers. And the Quakers are in Pennsylvania. So in the 1670s, two Quaker preachers make their way north and begin to preach in New England. And the Puritan authorities capture them, and they put them on trial in Boston, Massachusetts. And they hang them till they're dead. And John Norton, who is the minister of the first church of Boston, which is the church where 100 years later Paul Revere would tell somebody to hang a lantern into the window. He's the preacher there, and he writes a 53-page treatise saying that if we allow the Quakers to preach in New England, New England will become like Europe was under the Anabaptist. And he goes directly to Munster and says, this is what religion run amok looks like. And if we don't stop the freedom of religion to be expressed, it will turn out like this. So I wrote my paper, and I got a good grade on it, and I learned a valuable lesson. That within our movement are the seeds for brokenness. Because we're human. This whole idea of the individual making the choice, and that the power, the locus, the center of religious authority is in the group. What happens when that's hijacked by one or a few people, especially strong leaders? And the system really breaks down quickly. Sam Mullet isn't the only one. It's been replayed in numerous forms in churches throughout our history where it maybe hasn't been this bad or as bad as Burkholz, but it's there. And so one of the things that we need to think about when we think about this is, what does it mean to put ourselves under the authority of the body of believers, not the leader of the believers? First of all, we put ourselves under the authority of Christ. Then we put ourselves under the authority of the gathered group of believers. Even leaders need to be in that space. Power unchecked will ruin things. Munster effectively stops the spread of Anabaptism. Up till from 1525 to 1535, when Munster happens, portions of Europe, 25% of the population is rebaptized, and essentially stops it. Essentially stops it. It gave rise to a different approach where Anabaptists began to back away from the political agitation, and an almost urging for an apocalyptic use of the sword in some cases, to move away from that. But it also caught the attention of a young Dutch priest who is an alcoholic living in Friesland, whose brother, Peter, is drawn to this. There's a small group of, there's a group of quasi-Anabaptists who are moving from the Netherlands towards Munster to ally themselves with Munster, including a man named Peter Simons. And they take refuge in a cloister, an old convent called the Old Cloister. And they're captured there. And 300 of them are killed, including Peter Simons. His brother is Menno. And Menno begins to think and read scripture. Menno famously said that for the first 2 years of his priesthood, he didn't open the Bible once. But he begins to read. And what he reads in the New Testament catches his attention. And he begins to think about this. In 1536, he is rebaptized. And he becomes the leader who is able to kind of pull the movement together. So, Munster is to the north. So by 1535, there's strong pockets of Anabaptism. It's moving into the hills in the south, into the Emmental Valley. It's still in the cities, but it's beginning to be much more rural. And in the north, it's in Amsterdam. They're beginning to build churches. They're beginning to give some freedoms. And in the east, it's beginning to rise in Nikolsburg. By the way, 1535 is a momentous year because there's also a group of Anabaptists who are imprisoned in Passau. One of them is a man named Hans Betz. And Hans has preached so prolifically that the authorities have burned holes in both his cheeks so he can't get breath in his mouth. So there's about 50 of them in a prison in Passau. And they write these ballads and sneak them out of prison. And the Swiss church gathers them together and a little later collects them into their songs. And they're the Osborne, the Amish hymnal. And they're an amazing, if you can read German or the translation of them, they're wonderful stories of courage and trust. And so it has its expression in different places. So, I've covered a lot of ground tonight, but we need to, because we want to get to America sometime towards the end. So, questions? Yeah, Ben. Sorry, I don't get this one. Ben.
You mentioned that the earliest Anabaptist movement included nobility and peasants and sort of everybody in between. You mentioned a female noblewoman. Were male nobility?
Yeah. Klaus Heidegger was her uncle. He would have been a minor nobility. So he was one of the first recorded Anabaptists. He was Protestant. He was a Protestant reformer agitator, then he became Anabaptist. So yeah, there are men. Although this is a movement that appeals to women. And some congregations were more women than men. Also, it's such a different world. The average, I mean, you're old if you're in your 40s. Average life expectancy is, I think, 42.5 during this time period. So yeah, there are. Now, Munster also kind of moves, it turns some of the nobility off, where they would have been more sympathetic. Somebody else had a question.
I was curious what Menno's background was. Did he come from wealth? How did he get that position if he was the way he was?
He's kind of a middle. So in the one place where there isn't quite, so cities have the guilds, so there's almost a middle class there. And he would come from that almost middle class. They're still under the total control of the feudal system, but they actually are beginning to see some freedoms. Yeah, so he's from that middle space. Yes?
In Anabaptist history, we often talk a lot about individuals, but I'm curious, as a mother, are there any stories that you know of like Anabaptist families who had to, deal with that persecution?
Yeah. In fact, just recently read an account in Martyr's Mirror of a 12-year-old child who was martyred. Okay. Now again, the world is different, and 12 is different than 12-year-olds today because responsibility and so on. But yeah, there are accounts of nursing mothers who are captured. And the struggle is, what do we do with the babies? The authorities struggle is, what do we do with the babies? So yeah, there are entire families in some cases. But then there's also families that are torn by the movement, where Conor Grebel's wife and children left him. And he died at his sister's house a year and a half after his first baptism of the plague. So it is a really difficult time in that time period. But, and also, children die at such a high rate. I mean, that's what brings the average life expectancy down. And women die in childbirth. Like so, I mean, the rate is so high. It's almost unfathomable to us in the modern world. So, families are less defined by individual family units as the extended family units. So in many cases, generations would live in the same household. So it's less defined. Yeah, other questions? Ken?
Yeah, so I'm curious as far as, I'm assuming you talk about separation, but they didn't really dress differently or do anything different other than not show up to church on Sunday.
And not swear allegiance.
And not swear allegiance.
And not be willing to bear the sword. I mean, there are those things, but there's no distinct clothing patterns. Now, they would have, the movement, although they would have argued, don't wear the clothing of the rich. That is an issue early on. Like, should we dress ostentatiously or not? They would have said no. The way of Jesus said you should give that money to your brothers and sisters who are struggling. They really put a lot of emphasis on equality within the body. So some nobility who join sell everything and give it away. So clothing practices are really unique in that the sumptuary laws affect this, like the European laws about clothing. I mean, they're about clothing, they're about what you can eat. Like if you're a peasant, you can't eat roasted meat except on church holidays. You have to eat seethed meat, cooked meat. Can't roast your meat. The reason for that was when you get a really choice portion of meat, you roast it. You don't cook it in water. You get a bad portion, the bones and stuff, or oxtail, you cook it. So, they aren't supposed to eat that fancy stuff. That's reserved for the nobility. So they begin to call for much more. By the way, I love this. Poor people drank beer and rich people drank wine. everyone drank fermented drinks because water was dangerous. And Menno is accused of drinking wine and eating roasted meat. And he says, if I get the opportunity, I do. I like Menno. I used to think Menno was this stuffy old man, sitting in the corner making sure there's rules for everybody so they behave. He's not. He's a dynamic preacher who enjoys how he lives. So, clothing becomes an issue in the 1700s, much more. But they would have argued that if you dress ostentatiously, how can you be of the kingdom of God? Which is a legitimate question. One of the things that I noticed about my Amish brothers and sisters, like Monday night, if I didn't know who was wealthy, I couldn't pick them out. You just couldn't. They all look alike. The point is, that's the point. By the way, so I had that happen Monday night. Today, I had a podcaster from New York City who is one of the chief fashion podcasters, runs a fashion podcast. He's well known. She interviewed me, and she has all these intriguing questions like zippers. What is the problem with zippers? And I tried to lead her away from this kind of individual look at one thing and say there's a bigger issue here of equality and fairness.
So what's the issue with zippers?
If you allow zippers, and it's a legitimate, I went and asked my bishop friends, a couple of them, what problem is there with, I have no problem with zippers, but if we permit particular overcoats with zippers, we're going to wrestle with fashion. Like, you're going to go buy an expensive coat, maybe it has more colors on it than, so it becomes an issue. Do we all agree with that? No, I'm really glad for my zipper right now. It's tight, buttons let air in. So we talk about this, and I asked my Amish friends, why do you wear those funny pants? Funny, whoever thought of putting zippers in pants? They laugh at me. And then they'll say, they have a really good approach to this, many of them, the thinking one. They'll say it's cultural. But all of us make choices about how to live culturally. And if we give that up, what will we replace it with is what we will replace it with better than what we have. Well, that's legitimate. And then I can start to think, well, maybe I should be wearing barn-door pants. Anyway, but it's a much more their approach. So, but clothing play an issue, but just about the rich, the wealth. Other questions? Jeff?
Just two comments. So, it was interesting that in your telling of, in America, of the Puritans hanging the two Quakers, I couldn't, part of me wanted to say, well, Puritanism also kind of had like it's, you can see it a little bit.
The
in other
Munster-like
movements.
qualities.
Yeah. The second comment is really, do you get Menno Simons without Munster?
No. I don't think you do. It's the redeeming power of God that good comes out of bad. And I just don't think, I think Munster puts Anabaptism into the spotlight and Menno begins to read. His first thing he ever wrote in public was against Jan of Leiden, the leader of Munster. And he argues for a more equitable position against the use of force. It's 1536, so it's early in his Anabaptist career. So I don't think you get Menno without Munster. Doesn't mean we want Munster. But you know what, as Mennonites and as Anabaptists say, we should embrace Munster. I've had these arguments with myself, are they Anabaptists? They are. At least they're known as that. It's the whole argument, is Sam Mullet Amish? If he uses violence. And he is. So they're us, and we should claim them, and we should learn from them. See, I think I told you this, a clear understanding of history allows us to examine our traditions, to identify what is valuable and essential. So what we learn from the Munster story is that when we give power to a few within our circles, our theology doesn't work. Then we should evaluate current challenges to the truth in our world and untangle our response to this challenge. The challenges that we're facing today in the 21st century world in America are not new. They have a new face, they're not new. We can learn from history about how to untangle some of that. And I think history helps us understand and relate to the broader world. So, these are my people, including Munster. And we want to learn from them. Thank you. You're a good audience. If you think about it, I leave tomorrow morning, meet my wife. We have a day and a half kind of together. And then Friday night, I start a 6-series set in Catholic Virginia at a church, Rosedale Network of Churches church in the suburb of D.C. So I'm doing 2 on Friday night, 2 on Saturday night, and 2 on Sunday morning. And so they'll get what you do in 3 days. But it'll be, I'll be glad to be back in Berlin next Wednesday night. So, and it's supposed to weather during that time. So think about it, pray for us.